All right, playoff football is here, and so is handicapper Ron Marmalefsky to break down betting opportunities across wildcard weekend in the NFL. On the platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow Ron at RonAceSports. On his pinned post, you will find direction to a slew of weekly content worth incorporating into your sports media diet. And from the betting to the beer, it's always a good conversation with Ron on the show. Ron, great to see you. Welcome back to Props and Hops.
Thanks again for having me. I always enjoy our conversations. Doesn't matter which way they go and so on. Hey, it's January 2024. Happy New Year, first of all. And I can remember just a few months ago, we were starting the season, and now we're talking about 13 games left.
Indeed, we'll see who the last man is standing, hoisting the Lombardi Trophy in a few weeks. But Ron, first off, we've got a super wildcard weekend, I guess it's more formally called these days, to get to. And as we look ahead to that, also want to give a shout out to everybody who's live with us on Twitter and YouTube. Feel free to jump in the chat with any questions or comments, and we'll look to work that into the show wherever possible. And Ron, as we lead off, let's weave in the hops off the top here, because I understand that you have a beer in hand. I'd love to hear about what you're drinking this evening.
Okay, well, I think you asked me what was also the first beer I've had since the New Year's. And this will actually be the first beer since the New Year's. But right before the New Year's, we were lucky enough to have my sister and her family here, and our daughter and son-in-law here. And they made a beer run during the time that they were here. And I'm trying to think, I wrote it down somewhere. What's the name of the beer I had? Stone Imperial Stout. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Stone and Brewing Company.
Stone Brewing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, they're really close to you these days. Yes.
Yeah. 22 ounces, 9.1 alcohol by volume.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah.
That's a heavy
I don't know
hitter.
why they got me a big one though, but it was good. It was smooth enough. It went down just fine. Sandwiches and beer and conversation. That was the one I had right before the New Year's with the family. And today it's the traditional Guinness. So, you can never go wrong with the Guinness. So, we've all had it many a time, always sticking to the dark. I have some Heineken in the refrigerator that we bought for our guests that don't drink dark beer, and you can't go wrong with Heineken either.
Yeah, well, Guinness sounds very on brand for you. And I'll note, in the spirit of full transparency, I'm currently in the home stretch of training for a half marathon next weekend. So I'm just temporarily dialing things back a little bit, not doing dry January, but perhaps a damp January, if you will. So I'm glad that on your end, you've got a beer in hand, and I'm glad that it's a dark one as usual for you, because this might be a bit long of a show tonight. We've got a lot of valuable insight to get to, and I think that Guinness will warm up very nicely with time. So, Ron, as you start to work on that beer, also want to dive into some football talk, of course. Last time we had you on the show, Week 8, somehow our shared interest in the Carolina Panthers paid off against the playoff-bound Houston Texans.
Yeah.
And I think that was a very clear example of the ever-changing landscape that is the NFL. So, Ron, to that end, I'd love to hear about perhaps one way that your betting approach has evolved since you were last on this show in Week 8.
Okay, so it's hard to answer that question, because doing this for 40 years, I hope it doesn't change much from week to week and so on. Still the same mechanical, methodical method that I use at the beginning of every week. Look at the power ratings. Where am I differing? Why am I differing? Look at the technical factors. Each game presents a different matchup challenge, and look at whatever situational factors. I'd say one of the things that changes week 18 is how much I do all these quarter lines and half lines and fourth quarters, and first team to score and second half being more points than the first half, or vice versa, because you have all these games where some teams are going to try for some of the game, some teams are going to try for all of the game. And I bring that up not because it changed my methodology on week 18, but I think I'm going to try to incorporate that more, if not in the playoffs, but in other weeks next year. Like my pre-notes last week said, if the Raiders are ahead at halftime, they're going to milk the clock. They like to run the ball, whether it's Jacobs, whether it's Zamir White, whatever the case may be. Look for a low-scoring second half. look for a low scoring fourth quarter because the Rams and the 49ers are in the playoffs and they don't want to play anymore. It's August for them. They want to get healthy. And then unfortunately I had to babysit games like the Detroit Lions. I was waiting for Goff to go out of the game so I could bet Minnesota. And then Goff never went out of the game. So I had to sit there and watch that a little bit. So that's one method. And I want to talk about something a little different because I don't do the teaser route like you and of course Chris and others do. And they do it not based just on long teasers. Some people do it just based on that, but they do it because they actually like that game as if they would bet it straight. So there are times like last week, Cincinnati opened -3 against Cleveland, which I thought was personally ridiculous because Cleveland wasn't going to be starting. Cincinnati wanted that game desperately, the Battle of Ohio, and so on and so forth. So after hitting it at 3 and watching it move to 4.5, 5.5, and something, what am I going to do? Well, I really wanted more volume on that game. So I've taken to like mini parlays. And I've done this 3 times during the year. So this was the 4th, where I take a team like Cincinnati and I pair them with somebody else, but I manipulate the lines a little bit and I'm still getting plus value. So if you take Cincinnati, for example, go from -5.5 to -3, and you take another team, let's say the Lions, because that was another one that I wanted to take them in the first half. So you take the Lions money line first half to Cincinnati from 5.5 to 3, you're still going to get something like plus 140, plus 150 on the parlay. So that's something that I can rightfully say that I've been experimenting with and doing a little bit different after all these years.
And with parlays, I think typically people think of them as sucker bets, of course, in week 18 and rare scenarios elsewhere. There are opportunities to take advantage of some correlation. So maybe not so much of a sucker bet at all in this case. And what you just outlined wasn't necessarily a correlated parlay, but it sounds like you saw edges in a couple of different games with pretty specific angles. And the parlay was perhaps a way to increase exposure or amplify an edge in a way that you want to know what you're doing, but it's pretty intentional, maybe to keep your bankroll management in check while also increasing your odds of a decent payout. Am I describing that line of thought correctly?
Yeah, I think so. For example, Chris and I talked about this last Tuesday. The Seattle game against Arizona had a lot of conflict for me. Seattle's played so well at Arizona, and I really wanted to find a way to play them, but there was no way at the power rating that I personally was allowed to do that because if if there's a power rating and it points to the underdog, I cannot go against it based on a 30-year track record of how well it does. But I just didn't like Arizona off an emotional win. They had that big win with Kyler Murray come back and so on. So I said, well, I want to get Seattle at a decent price. I want to get them down to pick them because that's where I want them. Okay, I'll pair them to Cincinnati because I want more exposure at Cincinnati. So it's kind of the two things. My analysis told me I should probably take Seattle, but I couldn't take it at the points. And my exposure told me I wanted to have a little bit more on Cincinnati than I've had, most weeks because I had a formed opinion of that game.
All right, well, I'll jump in with one more angle in which my own approach has evolved since we last spoke, and that also ties in with Week 18 opportunities. Ron, last time you were on, I recall questioning what I perceived to be a pretty bullish stance from you on teasers in Week 18 specifically, knowing that that's not typically as much a part of your arsenal. And from my point of view at the time, thinking that teasers are a bet against variance and week 18 can be fraught with variance when we think of things like motivation, keeping track of who's in, who's out. I was hesitant to really buy into your approach. And lo and behold, last week, teaser legs covered in spades. I think if we look at advantage legs, getting a 6-point teaser crossing through those key numbers of 3 and 7, both Houston and Indianapolis covered their teaser legs, depending on when in the week you bet either of those teams. The Jets covered, winning outright in New England. The Bengals, as you touched on, covered their teaser leg as well. And then even getting outside the box, 6.5-point teaser legs, like the Raiders up to plus 3.5 hosting Denver, and the Saints up to plus 3.5 hosting Atlanta. A 10-point teaser, thinking about Buffalo going from -2.5 up to +7.5 at Miami, also pairing them with teams like Las Vegas and the Jets. I just want to say off the top, thank you for improving my own Week 18 ROI via that Week 8 discussion on how teasers can work out beneficially come the last week of the regular season.
I think it requires a lot of study. So I'm sure you did some pre-study. What are the motivations? What would the line have been? Because we knew, for example, Baltimore and Pittsburgh was a crazy line. If it was a regular season game, Baltimore would have probably been a double-digit favorite. Certainly by my power ratings, they would have been. But in this case, Pittsburgh was the favorite because Pittsburgh had the motivation of what they were playing for, and Baltimore, well, it's a hard-nosed rivalry, and even Baltimore's reserves are pretty good because of their draft process. But one would never have expected, for example, that Pittsburgh would have fallen outside the range because that was a very important game to them. I still liked Baltimore in that game, that, true confession, because I thought just about all their games fall within 3 or 4 points. But it just shows you that there's obviously a reason for where the line starts and how fast you have to get at it before it moves, such as the Cincinnati line, even the Vegas line. There were, lines move pretty quickly week 18.
Yeah, I would say to that end, with that level of depth and thought on what we just saw transpire in week 18, I hope that gives everybody a good sense of what to expect as we dig into each and every wild card game on this weekend slate. And in terms of the show format, going to call a bit of an audible on conventionally over the regular season, going through one side, one teaser, one prop that myself and the guest might like each week, and instead running through each game. And if there's one or maybe two bets or perhaps just leans, we don't need to force the issue here, but thinking that anything from sides or totals to teasers or props or derivatives can be on the table. Anywhere there's value, that's our goal, to provide as much value as possible over the course of this conversation. So Ron, let's kick it into gear with wildcard weekend in the NFL starting Saturday in the early window. Cleveland at Houston. The Browns currently a 2-point road favorite, total 44.5. Any bets or leans on your radar as far as this Browns-Texans rematch is concerned?
Well, the line was trending really, really close to 3. You would have to, I think you can get a 3 minus 115 was the best that I would have seen for Houston at the time, and then started trending back down again. I would have that strong lean of taking that 3 points just because of my power numbers. But one thing Houston has to do in this game, they have to play better against the pass. I know Stroud didn't play the first time they played, but that doesn't explain 30-something points that they had. They had a big lead in that first meeting, which wasn't that long ago, right? Just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, week
So,
16.
I want to take Houston. There's that talk about, but this is Houston's first playoff game. This is their coach's first playoff game. This is Stroud's first playoff game. I would argue that last week was their first playoff game because there was win or in. That was the time that, of course, they were playing another team, Indianapolis, that was also win or in. But if they were in that situation where they were the only ones, that they would have felt the pressure. But that game came down to the wire. They barely won it. So they've had that pressure. Now the question is, are they good enough? Because they have to make adjustments to their secondary.
I would say I'm with you, leaning Houston's way as the point spread currently stands. And when we see a 2-point home underdog, Ron, you can guess where I'm going here. I am looking at Houston in a 2-team 6-point teaser. The Texans up to +8, paired with Dallas -1 hosting Green Bay. And to keep it simple here, this is that classic advantage teaser, good at -120 or better. And I really do like the Texans' leg in this equation. Before lines open for this week's games, I went through the exercise of mapping out what I thought each point spread should be. I thought this one would be Pick'em, or maybe Cleveland, a much, smaller favorite. -2 was a small favorite as it is, but maybe -1 for the Browns was about as far as I could go. So I feel like based on that notion of maybe this game should be Pick'em, it almost feels like getting 8 points for the price of 6 in this teaser. And as you touched on, these teams squared off in week 16 in Houston. That's quite recently. The Texans were the short favorite, laying 2.5 against the Browns before Stroud's concussion kept him out of that one. The Browns ended up closing 3 against Case Keenum. And of course, we have to adjust the Browns up for their blowout win over Houston in that game, as well as a blowout a few days later against the Jets. But I think Browns -2 right now is underselling the gap between Stroud and Keenum and perhaps over penalizing Houston for a factor you touched on. This being Stroud's first playoff game, Ryan's first playoff game as the coach, and that trend that gets a lot of talk at this time of year. Overall, I think that this game is about a toss-up, so I like taking Houston up to +8. With the Dallas leg, I'm admittedly less enthused. If anything, I lean Green Bay at the current point spread of 7, but I see a market-making book like Chris, bookmaker, shaded toward Dallas -7.5. So it's almost like getting 6.5 points for the price of 6, taking the Cowboys down to -1 here. And of course, in a teaser, it takes 2 to tango. I feel like the Cowboys are that best remaining fit on the board to pair with Houston to try to navigate some key numbers here. In the spirit of bankroll management, not loving the Cowboys leg, this is a reduced play for me. I'd call it closer to 3/4 or maybe 0.8 of a unit. Ron, any thoughts on that teaser look, the Texans and the Cowboys?
Well, you'd expect kind of that both teams will make adjustments because they just played a couple weeks earlier. The one question I would have for you is, do you worry about all or nothing games being teased, meaning that losers' season is over? We know that. So if Houston gets behind, they may be going for it from their own 17-yard line, with 2.5 minutes to go, maybe even with 8.5 minutes to go. They're within teaser range, let's say, at that point, but they're taking more chances. Who's ever behind has to take more chances. Now, number one, so that would be my question to you. How do you feel about teases in general, where it's all or nothing, where that trailing team? But number two, maybe there's a comfort zone if the team you're teasing is the one you like anyway.
Yeah, I think to that first point, that is a very valid flag. And I would add to that, to quote the late, great David Malinsky, he'd often talk about in these winner go home games, if there is a margin and somebody can sense their season's over, they could let go of the rope, to use a phrase that Dave would often use, where they know that they're not going to have to go through a grueling week of practice. The coach isn't going to punish them in the days and weeks to come. The season's over. They can kind of check out. So there is this kind of risk when we're talking about this stage of the season, looking at teasers. I would say, to me, that is kind of counterbalanced by the second point you brought up, where I, especially in this first leg, would look to Houston anyway. And then when we're in the playoffs, one thing with teasers, I like to try to let market efficiency be my friend as much as possible. So throughout, especially the regular season, look to bet them later in the week unless I have a lot of conviction on a number that might get away and move out of teaser territory. And when we're at this stage of the season, the market is about as efficient as it gets. And I think that's reflected in the limits people will see at books that transparently post their limits on things like point spreads and totals for a playoff game versus an early season or mid-season game. So overall, it kind of comes out as a wash to me. I don't necessarily look to play more teasers in the playoffs, but where I see value, the potential flies in the ointment still don't deter me altogether.
Yeah, it's a point I would make, might have made later on in our conversation as well. It applies to props too. There's a different mindset in terms of props because your starters are going to play more. Because basically, we're not on load management, to use an NBA term, even though I don't follow the NBA. If week 14 and you're banged up and it's the third quarter and you're a little bit behind, and you want to make sure that player is going to be around for week 15, 16, 17, you're going to rest that player. But there are no resting starters in the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's one more note here, Hector, in the chat, noting that historically teasing home favorites of -7, not profitable for what it's worth. I don't have all the data. I'm not exactly sure what kind of sample size or how that's being sliced, but I understand the point. I think in general, I will fully admit that if I were just looking Dallas's way, usually if you're not in love with a teaser leg, just bet the point spread if you're inclined to get some exposure on that team anyway. In this case, I really do like the Houston leg. The Dallas leg, I'm less enthused by. But let's say a teaser, if you're laying -120, you need each leg to hit somewhere in the low to mid, 70% range each leg to make it a profitable equation. I think Houston may be a leg that I would like in the mid to high 70% range in terms of how often they come home. Dallas may be a shade lower than the standard break even. But just to get this teaser in play, Houston being so strong, I will admit Dallas is the leg that scares me more, all things considered, keeping bankroll management in mind. Not a full go for me, but just something to get what I think to be a net positive in terms of expected value, especially when it comes to the Texans side of things.
One of the joys of teaser bettors, I would think, is that you have one game at a time. So you can make adjustments as
Right.
each game finishes.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of the game that I like. I think kicking off first, we'll have a clear answer on Houston, and then if there's no exposure on Dallas, that might be a bit of relief by the time they kick off against Green Bay. So either way, we'll see. Clearly, I've got some trepidation here, not endorsing it as a full go, but I will definitely have some exposure on this teaser. Texans +8, Cowboys -1. Ron, you also touched on props. There's one prop that I've bet for this game that I like a good bit. I want to see what you think here. And that will be Joe Flacco, longest completion over 38.5 yards at a flat -115. Now, typically, I am very wary of props like this where like longest completion, longest reception, longest rushing attempt, where the mindset of a lot of casual bettors is, hey, all it takes is one play and I can cash. You could theoretically hit this on the first play of the game. That's true. But oftentimes, if you're over reliant on that angle without a sound handicap to support it, you might still be waiting for that play when the clock hits 0 at the end of the fourth quarter. So I typically don't like to just say, hey, all it takes is one and what could possibly go wrong. In this case, I think of the perception that a lot of us still have around Joe Flacco is the old man who just recently got up off the couch to return to the NFL, but he's been taking his shots. He started 5 games for the Browns in the regular season, and his longest completion was over 38.5 in all 5 of those games. That, of course, includes the Christmas Eve win the Browns had in Houston, where they're going back on Saturday. And then 2 stats from Cleve TA. He gave a great interview on the Football Analytics Show hosted by friend of the show, Ed Fang. I'd recommend everybody listen to that episode. Flacco, 3rd highest average depth of target in the league this season. Crazy to think about that in 2023, 2024. And with Flacco under center, the Browns number 3 in the NFL in terms of explosive pass rate. So that bodes well for this prop. And it's not just what Flacco is doing. I also think just from a game script type of standpoint, a bit of a free roll when it comes to volume. The more pass attempts Flacco gets, obviously, the more cracks we get at this. And in that Christmas Eve matchup in Houston, we saw 143 plays from scrimmage. For context, an average game in the NFL is closer to the mid 120s. So a lot of snaps just means more bites at the apple here. And the Browns offense, number 1 in the league this season in plays per game at 70. They had 75 plays in that Week 16 game in Houston. Another stat I heard TA mention on Ed's podcast, the Browns' pass rate in neutral game states has exploded since they got Flacco under center. So they were about average in terms of pass rate in neutral game states before turning to Flacco. They're among the highest in the NFL right now at throwing the ball when the game is competitive. And with the tight spread that we've talked about, I think that implies a lot of neutral game state. So a lot of pass attempts for Flacco here. And he's going to be doing this against the Houston defense that ranks 22nd in the league in EPA per dropback. So not terrible, but certainly not good. And they're bottom 3 in the league against play action. That's a big part of the Browns offense with Flacco. Also think it's worth noting that for Houston's defense, their top 3 pass rushers have all missed practice time this week. So a little bit of what the Browns are doing, a little bit of what the game state might allow, a little bit of what the Texans can, or I guess is a better term, can't do defensively. I also like that the environment here in a dome in Houston, weather not going to be a factor like it will be as a major storyline in Kansas City and Buffalo. So bottom line here, I think Flacco's aggression, it is worth noting, makes him high variance. In tight windows, he is prone to putting the ball in very dangerous spots. No surprise if he throws one or perhaps multiple interceptions. But when it comes to open receivers downfield, Flacco still has it. It seems like he's still elite at least delivering catchable passes in those spots. So for the purposes of this prop, I think it's a fair trade-off to take the bad with the good. Ron, any thoughts on Flacco longest completion over 38.5?
Let me say this. You have done your homework.
True.
Anybody who's listening or watching this show, should aspire to do what you did to cover all the angles. So I really think you deserve a lot of compliment for what you just came up with and your rationale. It's not just enough to have a play. You pointed out all these various reasons why you like that play. So I think that's great, and I think that's admirable. And I understand it because Houston generally will force teams to throw. Didn't quite happen last week. Indianapolis surprisingly had a big ground game against Houston. Much to my chagrin, one of the very few things I got wrong last week was how that game would play out. Houston and Indianapolis. I did not see Indianapolis wanting to run the ball so much. And even though they were successful, it ultimately led to their death. But in this particular game, if you think Flacco's going to throw the ball 35 to 40 times, which certainly I do, that increases the chances automatically that he's going to throw deep. And Houston is weaker against the pass versus the run. So I understand it. I have no problems with it.
All right. Well, a lean for you to the Texans against the spread here. 2 bets for me. A teaser, Houston +8 paired with Dallas -1, as well as Flacco longest completion over 38.5. Ron, let's move on to the nightcap on Saturday. It's going to be a frigid
I
one.
should
Oh,
give
go ahead.
one lean on a prop or one something on a
Let's
prop.
hear it,
Just
please.
throw it out. Houston's been sacked Cleveland's been sacked a large number of times, but Joe Flacco has been sacked 8 times in 5 games. So I think we had an artificially inflated sack number. You could get under 5.5 plus 120, and the under 6.5, because sacks are really up this year, started out at about 140, and it's creeping up and up and up now. But I took a little under 5.5 and under 6.5 to balance out the juice, because I think Flacco, with all of his experience, he's being sacked 1.6 times per game. Hopefully that bodes well.
Yeah, I like that look because when you mentioned sack rate is up this year, I feel like part of that, Sam Howell came to mind immediately. Tommy DeVito,
Yeah.
younger quarterbacks, maybe with nothing to lose, trying to make their imprint on this league. Flacco, for better or worse, maybe part of it is that at his age, with what he's already accomplished and experienced, maybe a little bit of this is self-preservation, but that's perfectly fine for the purposes of this bet. And that may also tie in with the fact that he's not unfamiliar with putting the ball in dangerous positions.
Yeah.
But if it means he's not putting his body in as dangerous of a position, to him, that may be well worth the trade-off. So with Flacco, I totally get it. And CJ Stroud, I haven't done the full scouting, but I think I've heard others who know the film a lot better than I do have said he has a really quick release. And the way that he processes things, yes, we've got the angle of a rookie quarterback in his first playoff game. But as much as that could possibly not apply to somebody in this situation, Stroud may be the guy who could be the outlier.
Yeah, and I probably wouldn't make the play if Houston wasn't at home under those dome conditions. Stroud more comfort level in this, being a rookie, going to the dog pound, it might change things a little.
All right, great. Well, we have a side lean and a prop lean from you to tie things together with the first game on Wildcard Weekend. And now I think we're at a good spot to move on to that likely quite frigid affair Saturday night, Miami at Kansas City. I hope you have Peacock because that's the only way you're going to be able to watch this game, evidently. We'll see if that carries on beyond this year, depending on how much money the networks want to pay the league to get sweet deals like this. Nevertheless, Kansas City laying 4.5, total 43.5. Ron, any initial bets or leans thinking of Dolphins Chiefs?
You know, I want to preface this by saying, even if Miami loses this game, I hope the fans and the players understand what a good year this has been for them. Tua stayed healthy the whole year. The defense improved under Vic Fangio. They understand what their offense is. Speed galore. The running back that they brought in from A&M, really good running back, really fast running back, and so on. This is a horrible spot for them. This is a team that saw 2 more of its starters go down last week. They only the Rams. You talk about the Rams. They drafted 14 people this last year. Miami did not have a first-round pick due to tampering. They did not have a first-round pick the year before due to the Tyreek Hill trade. They've had 8 total picks in the last 2 years. There is no team depth. They need to reset and rebuild during the draft. And unfortunately, this game comes up where they have a lot of injuries and a lot of guys out for the year. The week before, they lost one of their key pass rushers, Bradley Chubb. They lost the lead last week, 14-7, due to that punt return, that excellent punt return. And that kind of changed the shape of the game, and they have to be a little deflated. They also have 6 days off. And as hard as I've been on Kansas City all year, not their fault that the NFL gave them a brutal schedule, a negative rest differential, 6 straight weeks. Some of us cashed in on that very, very, very nicely during those 6 weeks. Well, guess what? Last week was a bye week for Kansas City. They were locked into the number 3 seed. Most of those guys were in street clothes. I took Kansas City at 3 minus 115, 3.5. I think it was a straight 3.5 as the line changed and stuff like that. You have to throw out power ratings in this game, in my opinion, although the power ratings are not that far off. But Kansas City was not a great team during the year. But this is a reset for them against a team going into cold weather. It's just a bad spot for Miami, and I'll have to live and die by it. But I have a definite opinion in this game.
I appreciate the macro level perspective you shared there, because when it comes to this game, I think that it is almost universally agreed upon that this is just a brutal spot for Miami, and that makes it tough to find a lot of value in some of the more conventional markets. Trying to identify something here, just one lean in this game for me. I'm considering longest field goal under 47.5 yards. As far as I can tell, that's pretty much the standard line for most games. And I think that this game does not fit the standard setting. The weather, we're going to look at temperatures around 0 degrees and closer to minus 25 with a wind chill. I mean, that's about as extreme as it gets. I think it's an understatement to say that the ball could feel like a brick. And for kickers, that could make distance really tough to come by. I think that might affect decisions that coaches make in certain situations that would normally call for a field goal attempt as well. And then building on what you laid out, I definitely see the blowout potential in this one. So maybe a bit of a free roll on Kansas City, as heavily as they've been bet, just building up a big lead, knowing Miami is really banged up, short week. They could be literally and figuratively out of their element on Saturday night at Arrowhead. And if the Chiefs are nursing a big lead in the second half, their priority could become running out the clock and shortening the game. And for the Dolphins, if they're facing a big deficit, they might have to go for it on fourth down out of necessity in spots that would otherwise call for field goals in more typical game scripts. So right now, a pretty strong lean for me to the longest field goal under 47.5 yards. Ron, any thoughts on that one?
What makes sense in that weather, what dooms overs in these high scoring games or in these temperature games at 1 degree, 10 degrees, or whatever it is wind. So I know the wind chill brings it into the negative. I'd have to see exactly what the wind is. Miami's kicker, has he kicked in these kinds of conditions before? That's half of the kicks that are going to be tried. Or if Miami gets in the field goal range, would be by a kicker who may not have kicked it in this weather. So I wouldn't have a problem with that one.
Well, speaking of wins, we can have a lot of fun with that potentially when it comes to betting opportunities on Sunday in the first game. The Steelers at the Bills, Buffalo laying 10, total a low 35.5, because that weather, the wind in the forecast has really got this total bet heavily to the under, and it might not be done quite yet. Ron, any bets or leans when we think Steelers Bills?
Yeah, so I didn't get involved conventionally in this particular game because I have a negative spot for both teams. Part of me, unsubstantiated, just a guess or whatever, Buffalo's been in win or go home mode almost for 5 weeks now. Remember when they were somewhere around the 11th seed in the AFC? They were 6-6. There was not really a pathway. And then all of a sudden there was a pathway because Jacksonville started losing. Denver started losing after they had their little mini crazy winning streak when they weren't really putting up points, but it looked like they were better, which we know that wasn't the case. Cincinnati had already lost, Joe Burrow and stuff like that. Pittsburgh started to have a little bit of a losing streak. So lo and behold, Buffalo gets in the playoffs. The question I have is, do they exhale now, or do they keep the pedal on the metal? Is it human nature now that they got in? They take a deep breath, and does that hurt them? By the other token, you have TJ Watt not playing, and I want no part of a Pittsburgh team that doesn't have TJ Watt in the lineup, because he makes other people better. I really, the only thing I did is what a lot of people did, so I take no credit for that. The posted quarterback, number of attempts, number of completions, number of yards, whatever it was at the opener, I took, and you could see them free falling because of the weather. I realized that even if I didn't like that kind of bet, you have to jump ahead of the market because it's not going to go any better. At the worst, you could get out of it if you don't like it and pay juice. But we don't have to worry about playing juice now. We could just decide whether we want a middle or hedge part of it, because that line was never going to go higher than what we originally saw.
And when it comes to some of those quarterback props, Ron, is there anything at currently available numbers you're seeing where you still like anything to the under? Or perhaps if things been bet so heavily as word about this forecast has spread so far and wide that maybe you're looking to go back the other way in terms of any specific angles there?
Yeah. all the Rudolph props have been bet way out of range now. You can't bet anything on Mason Rudolph. You could still get Josh Allen within a few yards of his total yardage. So if you think he won't put the ball in the air as much, and I kind of think he may not put the ball in the air as much, because if you look at their winning streak, they trusted James Cook, their running back, a lot more than Josh Allen. Josh Allen tends to try to win the game all by himself, and he's aware of that, but he can't quit it. It's like anything or whatever. I know that's my fault, but I'm still going to do it. And we saw one or two of those examples even week 18. So keeping Josh Allen out of harm's way would mean under his passing total. And certainly if they get a lead and they think Pittsburgh cannot beat them offensively, then I would say that's the only one still in range.
All right, so we're looking at a possible Josh Allen under that could still have some value. Ron, I want to see if you see any value on a couple leans I've got for this game. I'll lead off with another teaser, this one channeling our mutual friend, Las Vegas Chris. Looking at Buffalo as part of a 3-team 10-point teaser, which is typically good at -130 or better. Taking the Bills down to pick them, basically just asking them to win this game, pairing them with Cleveland +8 and Green Bay +17. So again, this along the lines of LVC, he really knows what he's doing here most of the time. I'm breaking some rules, trying to navigate some key numbers. And in the case of the Bills here, looking to take the clearly superior team at home to essentially just win outright. And with the Browns, I know I lean Houston +2, but I think the value of crossing up through a touchdown with Cleveland also offers some appeal here. And with the Green Bay leg, I would be less surprised if the Packers win this one outright than if the Cowboys blow them out. So I don't mind getting a nice cushion with the Packers. As a disclaimer here, really important to know the house rules with this type of bet. At some books in a 3-team 10-point teaser, a push on any leg, so Cleveland +8 or Green Bay +17, would get the whole bet graded as a loss. At other books, the same push on any one leg would get the whole bet graded as a push. So please keep an eye out for favorable house rules and know what you're signing up for if you're going to make a bet like this. Ron, for people with those favorable house rules in place, any thoughts on a 3-team 10-point teaser? Buffalo pick'em, Cleveland +8, Green Bay plus a whopping 17.
I don't know enough about the strategies for the 10-point tees other than in cold weather games with lower scoring. Obviously 10 points carries more weight, in my opinion, especially if you have the favorite in that particular case. I do have opinion when it comes to Green Bay and Dallas, and I could see two scenarios developing in that game. And so when we talk to it, you'll probably understand why I wouldn't be crazy about teasing either way in the Green Bay Dallas game.
I think I know where we're going there, and let's get there shortly. I'll just run one more thing by you for this Bills-Steelers matchup. I am also giving strong consideration to betting the yes on a successful 2-point conversion at +450. I'm seeing that at a leading regulated book. And typically, again, kind of like the Flacco over, betting yes on a prop like this, I'm typically very wary of because it's so easy just to imagine scenarios where this has happened and I think it's the availability bias where we know of these rare cases where 2-point conversions do happen. We remember those a lot more vividly than the litany of games where 2-point conversions don't happen. They don't even get attempted, let alone converted successfully. But in this case, another situation where I think the books are pricing this off the charts, to use a David Malinsky term, just looking at the standard 2-point conversion, yes, no line, given the spread and total versus the pretty unique setting for this game. It could have a lot of parallels to that Patriots-Bills Monday night game a couple years ago, where kicking might be untenable. And weather aside, Mike Tomlin is quite the wild card when it comes to occasionally just going for 2 on a whim anyway. And in a case where it could make sense, I see the element of a free roll where Pittsburgh is down 14 late. They score a touchdown to get within 8. It's well known at this stage that the correct move is to go for 2 in that situation. So between the weather, the Tomlin wild card, the possibility of the Steelers trying to get in the back door late in the game or make it a 1-score game and go for 2 in a spot that would really call for it, I see a few different avenues to this cashing, and +450 seems like it's quite appealing relative to what I think a fair price would be for this line. Ron, any thoughts on the prospects of potentially seeing a successful 2-point conversion Sunday in Buffalo?
Sounds like +450 is higher than normal. I mean, I I would think it's higher than normal, and maybe it's priced that way because there will be fewer touchdowns.
Right.
That's what
It's
they're
tied to the
thinking.
total.
Yeah. So because of the weather, fewer touchdowns. In the college game, these will there be a 2-point conversion is right now underpriced because teams, University of Oregon is historically whenever they score their first touchdown, they go for two, for example. It's from the 2 yard line. It's the college game. There's more yardage, more points usually in college games. We saw it in bowl games a lot. I wouldn't be surprised to see it with a Detroit team or with a Dallas team. And the Pittsburgh Buffalo, I don't know. I think 450 is a nice number. I'm not saying it's a bad play. I think in general, 2-point conversion. Will there be a 2-point conversion? If they're pricing it the same way this year as they have in previous years, then it's advantage to the player.
And I think that's the key here, because if we're talking about the break even probability for this bet, if you think there's a 20% chance of there being a successful 2-point conversion, that's profitable at this price
Right.
point. So definitely not saying that it's more likely than not to occur, but all things based on the price, that's a look that I'm very intrigued by. But Ron, you also touched on being intrigued by a couple angles in Packers Cowboys. So let's get there and turn the page over to the NFC now. Cowboys laying 7, total 50.5. And if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, it sounds like you could see this one being quite the high variance affair Sunday afternoon in Dallas.
Yeah. The first thing is I did play the overs in the game at 49.5. I think you can still find 50. I looked a little bit. A lot of them are 50.5, 51, if I remember now, but I think there was still a 50 out there. I just have this kind of feeling that Jordan Love likes to throw deep. He might have Watson back in the game. Dallas likes to take chances defensively. They routinely have one or more guys that are up there in the league lead in defensive interceptions. We know under McCarthy, they seem to run a faster pace offense. I don't have that in gospel. Maybe you know that as more than I do. So I kind of see it that way, but I also don't know how to handicap this particular game because there are things I like about both teams. There are things I dislike about both teams. So my scenario is that I wouldn't be surprised. I've seen it before that Dak Prescott throws a perfect 158.3 passer rating, shreds Joe Barry's defense, finally gets Joe Barry. I have a lot of relatives and friends who really don't like Joe Barry. And in general, my response to that is Joe Barry doesn't tend to make his teams better in December. A lot of coaches make their teams better in December. Joe Barry doesn't necessarily do that. So I could see Dallas running away with it. But I could also see another scenario. Jordan Love hits on these plays. Dallas gets tight because it doesn't matter that Dallas won their division. This season is a unmitigated disaster if they can't win a playoff game. And in fact, expectations are that they're going to the championship game. If they lose to San Francisco or somebody like that in a title game, okay, so be it. But if they don't get to the NFC championship game, I think a lot of people in that organization are going to say, we failed. And it doesn't matter that Mike McCarthy won all these games. There's been no ringing vote of endorsement from Jerry Jones from him. So because of that, I see wide variance in this game. But either way, I'm kind of leaning toward the over.
All right, totals not in my wheelhouse, so I like the way you broke down a lean toward the over, and something that tends to be more in my wheelhouse that dovetails nicely with your look there would be what I like to think of as the props and hops special, a prop bet shortest touchdown under 1.5 yards. And from a pure math standpoint, when we have a total this high, that bodes well for the prospects of lots of touchdowns. Lots of touchdowns in turn bodes well for the prospects of at least one 1-yard touchdown. And from a handicapping standpoint here, with the Cowboys, Dak Prescott, a nice dual threat quarterback down near the goal line. With the Packers, Aaron Jones has really reemerged as a force down the home stretch this season. And the Cowboys defense last in running back rushing success rate. So if the Packers are near the goal line, shouldn't be too tough to get Aaron Jones in the end zone. Or they could also be a dual threat offense down in that type of situation. Jordan Love playing really well right now, and Matt LaFleur capable of being very creative with his play calling. So we could see either team punch it in from the one should they get there. From a pricing standpoint, This is currently listed at minus 150 at a leading regulated US book. I consider it good to minus 165. So we've got some wiggle room here. I know it sounds like a 1 yard touchdown is a very specific outcome, kind of threading the needle, but it happens a lot more than a lot of fans and casual bettors would probably think. Things like pass interference in the end zone can set this up really nicely, or just the fact that the field tends to get really compressed down near the goal line. So 1 yard touchdowns, especially with totals in this range, especially with these two teams, I feel like is a look that I'm pretty enthused by on the Sunday prop betting slate. Ron, any thoughts on possibly sprinkling some exposure on that type of prop to go along with your look at the over?
The only times I've ever bet this is because in the old days, before I got kicked out of a couple places, I used to get free arbitrage on this play. And I said, okay, I don't know what's going to happen between this, but I know I'm getting plus 120 at this company and minus 140 at the, or
Jeez.
plus, whatever it is, where I had a 20-cent value. And I said, okay, you give me that 3 hours later, you're going to put some money in my account in one place and not in another, and I'm going to get this money. So I don't have a feel for that, but I will say both teams can get pretty grabby on the secondary. So you have a good point in terms of you could see a PI in the end zone.
Yeah, I will not be shedding a tear if that does indeed transpire in this one. And Ron, I know you seemed fairly neutral on the spread with a lot of the variance in play here, so I won't ask you too much about what you think here. I will close the loop on what I touched on earlier, leaning toward the Packers catching 7. It was a bet for me at 7.5, but at 7, not going to do it. I made this a 5.5 point spread before lines opened, and I have too much respect for the market to make that the sole reason for betting something like this. But I think it's also worth considering insights from people I really respect, such as Sharp Clark, who made Green Bay his best bet on the Move the Line podcast. That was at plus 7.5, so a key half point to consider there. But also Zuma on today's Forward Progress show, the Packers at plus 7 were still his best bet. And a couple of handicapping highlights I took away. Jordan Love showing significant improvement over the course of the season. Clark was really early to identify that as a guest on this show on week 11. He was the first person I heard who was super bullish on Jordan Love, and a lot of people have since followed suit with what Love has shown in recent weeks. And then also considering for the Cowboys, their stats on both sides of the ball, a decent bit inflated by feasting on some weak opposition. They've struggled to step up in class, and I think relative to a lot of teams they faced, especially trying to defend the Packers offense, this could represent a step up in class. So, Ron, I know you think it's a high variance affair, but I would say, if anything, lean toward the Packers at the number plus 7.
I could see them winning, and I could see them coming in second by a large margin. It's just one of those games where if you don't have to bet, you don't bet it.
Exactly. Our biggest edge, it's my mantra here, but our biggest edge as bettors is that we get to pick and choose our spots. The books have to throw up a line for every game. And I do think, well, I don't think this is an inherently low variance game. I think you see more variance in the equation than I do here for people who can shop around and find good alt lines. Sometimes there might be too much juice baked in for that to be a plus EV move. But if you want to really lean into the variance and take some alt lines, then that can be a good plan of attack for a matchup like this as well.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned that I have an article coming out where I talk about alt lines. This is not a strength of mine. So I don't profess to have wisdom in this area, but it has come to my attention that different books might have different alt lines. It's one of those rare cases where you need to shop around because you can get some real good value there. So if you think that you like the Dallas side and you're willing to give a few more points, you could easily get some good plus money. And same thing with Green Bay.
All right, well, let's see how much variance you foresee in another game with a high total. The Rams at the Lions. Detroit currently laying 3 at minus 115 juice. Total 51.5 is a consensus number. Ron, first question, as with all the games on this week's slate that I'm going to throw your way, any bets or leans as far as you're concerned looking at this Rams-Lions matchup?
I have no bets on this game. It's a fascinating game for a number of reasons. It's not Goff versus Stafford, but it's Goff versus McVay because they had the exit interviews. They talked about what went right, what went wrong. There's a grudge going on, but it's also Stafford versus Detroit. Stafford versus Detroit, that stadium hit the first 10 plus years of his career and so on. A lot of variables. I would probably be inclined to lean at 3.5, but we're not seeing 3.5 right now. I think it's much closer to a solid 3, if I'm correct. I've looked at it from time to time. I'd
Mhm.
probably rather have 3.5 points than do anything else in this game, but I wouldn't be comfortable either way. It's just one of those games that I think whichever quarterback just doesn't have it. We've seen occasionally Stafford with multi-interception games. We've also seen Goff occasionally with multi-interception games. I think both teams are going to try to establish the run. And there's good reason for both of them to try to do that because Sean McVay of the Rams, he's relied on this one running back, Karen Williams, who's really carried the load. And what Detroit has done managing their rookie Gibbs workload is for this reason to get and do something in the playoffs, not to overuse them before they get to the playoffs. And the 1-2 punch with Montgomery and Gibbs, I think these teams are better off establishing the run in this game.
All right. Well, if teams are looking to establish the run and they're looking to do so near the goal line, I will not be disappointed because I'm going to double dip here with that props and hop special. This is another game. Regular listeners could have guessed it given the total where I do like the shortest touchdown under 1.5 yards. Similar handicap to Packers Cowboys, so won't belabor the point too much there. We'll note that this one with an even higher total does stand out a nice bit. And the Rams is a team not as appealing for a bet like this. They do have a strong ground game with Kyren Williams, but sometimes McVay can take chip shot field goals where it's probably a better move to go for it on fourth down. On the flip side, though, the Lions, I think, are the most appealing team of all for a bet like this because their fourth down aggression is off the charts, often in a good way. Not talking about going for 2 from the 7-yard line, although I still do think there's a decent possibility that Campbell would have called a timeout had the Cowboys not jumped offside. But getting back on track with this bet, I can easily foresee a scenario where it's 4th and 2 at the Rams 35. And in a lot of situations, teams might go for a 53-yard field goal attempt, and the Lions would opt to go for it on that fourth down. And that same type of situation for them could lead to a goal to go situation on that same drive. And should the Lions get down near the goal line, I really like that they have a stout offensive line, and Ben Johnson's creativity is a sight to behold. Future Chargers head coach Ben Johnson, if all goes well, by the way. So I'm currently seeing this one priced at minus 155 at a leading regulated book. I also consider it good up to minus 165, as with that Packers Cowboys look at this same prop. Ron, you already told us what you think about this prop in general in the last game, so we can keep it nice and short. But anything based on this handicap that has you thinking any differently than you did for the same look at that Packers Cowboys game, in this case pertaining to Rams Lions?
So I misjudged where you were going to go with the prop. I was going to say, I hit it. I got it. He's going to go Detroit under 1.5 field goals, but that's not what you did. But
that might have
I
been
was
even
thinking,
better. You've got
whoa,
me thinking now. Yeah, we'll
yeah.
put that
I
into
said,
the
what
lean.
if he doesn't want to go for field goals? Maybe all these fourth down attempts will lead to fewer field goal attempts. Now sometimes in low scoring games, you get more field goals because they're not good inside the 20. It's kind of a misnomer thing. I don't know what their track record is, but I will tell you this because I did this research. The Rams special teams, it's a liability for them. That's a real problem for them. They attempted 43 field goals, and they were among the worst at hitting those field goals. They were under 75% for one kicker, under 75% for the other. That's not good in today's NFL standards. The Detroit Lions attempted 21 field goals for the whole year. That might be the lowest in the entire league if you take out, maybe some of the teams that couldn't score that well. But, for as many points as the Lions put up to attempt only 21 field goals, pretty interesting, 19 of 21.
All right, I'm going to have to give this a good look and see if I can shop around for a good price on that Lions field goal total under 1.5. I think that's an even stronger handicap than anything I could bring to the table for the shortest touchdown prop. So some homework to do on my part after this recording. Ron, one more bet that I want to run by you here. I'm going to have some healthy exposure on. I'm looking at the Rams in the third quarter plus half a point. So a derivative here, Rams third quarter plus half a point. Seeing it available right now at minus 135. And I think we've got some wiggle room here. I consider it good to minus 150. Sounds like a lot of juice to lay for a derivative like this, perhaps. But when we're talking about a sample size of a quarter, half a point can really loom large. A lot of quarters can just end up with each team scoring the same amount of points or both teams not scoring at all. I don't think we're going to see a scoreless third quarter in Detroit on Sunday night, but that half point could still loom large here. And what I think will come into play, something you touched on, Sean McVay's familiarity with Jared Goff. I think from the outset of the game, the Lions can try to keep the Rams on their toes, but for even a mind such as Ben Johnson's, Detroit can only get so creative with its game plan, especially with Sam Laporta's status in doubt. So I expect the Rams to adjust to any wrinkles and exploit that familiarity factor coming out of halftime. I lean Rams +3 for the full game, but as you touched on, when 3.5s are out there, the best of the number is so far gone. I think we're better off with this angle. So Ron, any thoughts at this derivative look? Rams third quarter plus half a point, available now at -135, perhaps good up to -150.
Yeah, I think you have to weigh in the variable that what if they don't receive the third quarter kickoff? Is that a 50-50? I don't know their coin toss records or what teams do or don't do. If you have that information,
All I
that's
can
great.
say
If there's
there
an
is
angle.
that it is not 50-50.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because at 50-50, you have to weigh that into the equation. You would figure in a high scoring game, the team with the most opportunities in any one quarter is more likely to score more points. That's just a given. I think plus a half is you'd always look plus a half. I don't think you'd ever give a half in this kind of competitive nature, but I don't have a particular opinion one way or another. I assume that you've done a lot more research on this than I have.
I have, and I try to share as much as I can on the show. Some things need to remain privileged to a certain extent, but I think you kind of alluded to something that could really be a nice feather in the cap of that handicap for anybody interested in a Rams third quarter look catching half a point. So,
okay, that case closed there. And all the things that I've shared over my 130 years on this planet Earth, there's still one I don't share, so it's fair.
all right. I'll see what I can tease out of you after we end the stream and we're off the record, so to speak. But we've still got one game to get to on Wildcard Weekend. The Eagles at the Bucks on Monday night. Philadelphia laying a flat 3 at a lot of books, total 43.5. Ron, any bets or leans for this one?
I speculated in this game because I have no idea really what I want to do in this game. I just know my power ratings point me to Tampa. And the worst case scenario is I could get off my Tampa +3 bet. The best case scenario is that a lot of players, including quarterback Hurts, we found out that he hasn't practiced a bit so far. It's Thursday. I wouldn't have expected him to practice Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. What happens if he's announced out of the game and Marcus Mariota takes over? This line takes a nosedive. The one area that concerns me, you could speak to this. I'm going to ask Chris the same question. I think I've already asked him before, is that the books by hanging a 3, Philly -3 in a situation where everybody knows Philly hasn't played well, the books are telling you we want Tampa money. And that scares me a little bit, to be honest. I can't go against the power ratings. I think Tampa has enough veterans on the roster, both offensively and defensively, that they know what it's like to be in the playoffs. They've been in the playoffs just as much as Philly has been in the playoffs between Brady and this year as well. So I like the value, but I'm just scared that they're hanging a number for a reason.
I hear you about something maybe being a little suspicious about this number, but when it comes to the books wanting certain action over time, maybe it's the people that I've come to trust and listen to. I am much less leery of what the books want and much more suspicious of, okay, who are bettors that might not have a public profile, that might not be putting things out there, and what are they doing to shape the market in a certain way? I think a lot of times books get a lot of credit. People love to say Vegas knows, when in reality, it's the sharpest bettors in the world, the people with the most money who know what they're doing. Those are the ones who know. I think the good books, like a Circa kind of philosophy, to quote Spanky, if I'm getting it right, hang a line, take a hit, and just let the number get beat into place by bettors who have a clue about all this. So when I saw Philly get bet up from -2.5 to -3, that did definitely raise an eyebrow. All things considered, I am going to take the plunge. I already have taken the plunge on Tampa +3, and I would endorse that as a bet worth making right now. I think something I go back to as part of my process, thinking about curation oftentimes is my best form of creation. A lot of the bettors I respect to have shared similar sentiments. Cleve TA on the Football Analytics Show, Suma on forward progress, Rob Pizzola with his best bet on forward progress, all on the Bucks plus the points. Rob noted he considers this good. I think up to minus 118. I think that makes sense. A lot of books maybe consider minus 115 the cutoff if they would then jump to minus 120 as the next tick on the spread. Looking at the Bucks here, some of these handicapping highlights, you touch on it a bit. Philly largely propped up by their priors. I think their current health, however, is a big red flag. At quarterback, the most important position on the field. Jalen Hurts, that injured middle finger on his throwing hand, said earlier today he hasn't thrown a ball yet this week. Cluster injuries at wide receiver. A.J. Brown injured his knee last week at the Giants. Likely to go, but quite possibly going to be limited. And I think Devontae Smith could really be the limited receiver for the Eagles as he's looking to make his return from a high ankle sprain suffered quite recently in week 17. So I do expect everyone to play. I just don't expect them all to be playing at 100%. And I think that's one of the last remaining market inefficiencies when we're talking full game point spreads in the NFL. A lot of people treat in or out as a binary, 100% or 0 that you're going to get from somebody. And I think that when we can price in limitations for players who are playing through injury, that's where I get to a lot more value on Tampa at the king of key numbers in that +3. And the Eagles' injuries, by the way, not just limited to their offense. Darius Slay, a key member of their secondary, banged up. Again, I think he's going to go, but just not at 100%. And by the way, Matt Patricia, not helping matters since taking over as defensive coordinator for Philadelphia. In fairness, for Tampa Bay, Baker Mayfield, their most important player, has also been hobbled lately. So, of course, that is absolutely worth monitoring. But otherwise, it's a pretty clean bill of health for the Bucks. One more factor here beyond all the injuries. Oh, jump in on the health front before I go any further here.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, well, I mean, we're both in it because we see value. I'm just not plunging, with two hands, all my chips on the table. I just have a portion of my chips on the table, thinking that I may get the best of the number when everything settles because of the injuries you're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. Especially when we're talking full game spreads in the playoffs. I mean, anybody who's looking to unload on anything or thinks that they can uncover a lock in this type of market, that's a bit overzealous to me. So I think it's definitely worth preaching bankroll management. Just because I'm trying to make the best case I can for betting Tampa Bay doesn't mean betting a penny more than you can afford to lose if the Eagles win this one going away.
Yeah, no problem with that. The only lock I know is Drew Lock.
There we go. Is he still in the league?
Yeah, he's with Seattle, right? He won them a game
while
that's right. Geno Smith was out.
Yeah. Okay, yes, that epic comeback. Speaking of the Eagles, by the way, with regard to this handicap, to close the loop here, the Eagles' point differential on the season, +5.
Yeah.
That's the second worst of any playoff team. Pittsburgh, go figure. The Steelers, negative point differential, weaseled their way into the playoffs. But with the Eagles having a pretty meager point differential for a playoff team, it's not necessarily a fluke. They've got a lot of injuries now, but over the course of the regular season, they were generally a fairly healthy team, had a pretty soft strength of schedule. So it's pretty surprising that as dominant as they were last year, again, a lot of those priors seem to be propping up the Eagles right now. But in reality, what we've seen over the course of this season, and especially more recently, telling a different story. So overall, this isn't me saying Tampa Bay is necessarily any good. I'm just not sure the Eagles are all that much better. Because if we look at this spread and factor in home field advantage, we're basically being told that the Eagles are 4 to 4.5 points better than the Bucks. I just really struggle to see that big of a gap between these two teams at this stage.
I think a lot of us, myself included, waited for the Eagles, who had a slow start and were not winning by margin earlier in the year, to become the 2022 Eagles. And at some point by the end of November and December, we had to realize, hopefully most people realized, but I don't think most people realized, that the Eagles were not the 2022 Eagles. They were the 2023 Eagles. So I think the name on the jersey got them a little bit more points or a little bit more hype than they really deserved, because in the end, when you have that point differential, you're not an 11-16. Your record, something is off, and that's a Pythagorean thing for next year. But meanwhile, for this year, something's still off, and we'll find out if they're one and done.
Well, from the name on the front of the jersey to the name on the back of the jersey, Ron, I've got to lean on a player prop I want to run by you for this one. And it is pending pricing and availability. That's because we're still waiting for full confirmation that
Yeah.
Devontae Smith is a go for this one. If and when that's confirmed, which I expect it to be confirmed between this recording and the game kicking off, I'm looking at a split ticket on Smith receiving yards under and reception yards under. And I'll give a hat tip here to Hitman on Forward Progress today. He spoke to Smith really rushing back from a high ankle sprain suffered just 2 weeks ago. And Smith has a really slight frame to begin with when we're talking about an NFL athlete. And he relies a lot on his quickness, getting out of breaks. An injury like this could really magnify some limitations for him. Plus, we've already touched on it. Jalen Hurts' ability to deliver accurate passes is also a big question mark right now. So, moving on from the handicap to the pricing I'm anticipating, receiving yards for Smith closed in the mid 50s in the games leading up to his injury. My initial thought, given this situation, I'd be inclined to play his receiving yards under, call it good, anywhere down to 44 and a half. So he'd need 45 to beat us here. As far as receptions go, he's closed 4.5 over under in the range of flat minus 115 vig in most games leading up to the injury. My initial thought here, receptions under, good at that same 4.5 number, but I would lay up to, I think, minus 145 here. So waiting to see what eventually gets posted for Smith. Ironically, Ron, I think last time you were on this show, I was also eyeing an Eagles player prop to the under that was pending availability at the time of the show. That was a Jalen Hurts rushing yards under back in week 8. Fortunately,
Yeah.
that was a rocking chair winner. Fingers crossed we can see the same with Devontae Smith here. Any thoughts on that look on the split ticket? Smith receiving yards and receptions to the under.
Yeah, I believe that show produced a lot of prop winners. So, good analysis again on your part. Yeah, we haven't seen numbers. I haven't seen numbers on Smith. I would think it's contingent on who else is playing, because let's say AJ Brown doesn't go, then Smith is going to get a lot more targets. Maybe his number would be punched up for receiving yards, but he may catch a lot of these short passes. So I need to see exactly who's going. But I would think with Hurts's condition, how far he could throw the ball, how much time he wants, does he want to get sacked? Does he want to throw quicker? I would think the receiving yards probably low, unless you think he's going to break a big one. You can always lose a receiving yard under prop just by one big throw. I know that's a danger for people like me who play a lot of under props. But I would be tempted to say, yeah, if everybody goes, then Smith makes sense for an under in both directions.
I will also add to that as a macro point. You kind of gave the counter to my thought that I'm often wary of playing like the Flacco longest completion over because of that notion. All it takes is one. That can sound very enticing, but in the long run, it's not necessarily plus EV just for that reason alone. I think to your point, it can give people trepidation to place a bet knowing that, okay, on the first play of the game, this could lose. If the Eagles have a touchback, they get the ball at their own 25, and there's a 75-yarder to Smith. I mean, we saw the Texans open up with a 75-yarder last Saturday night at Indy. If we see something like that, your bet goes up in flames the second the game starts. I know that's no fun. I know that it's often not a ton of fun rooting against human achievement, but I also think that that kind of psychological obstacle that a lot of people wrestle with and ultimately can't get to the window because of can give a lot of value to bettors who are willing to suck it up, knowing that sometimes it's going to get blown up right out of the gate. But more often than not, if you just let time and the law of averages do its thing, if there's value on this, yes, it could go awry in a hurry, but it could also be, a rocking chair winner, and we wouldn't even have to sweat it come the fourth quarter a lot of times. So a bit of a mental game there, but I try to account for that and at the same time not let it overpower too much of the rest of the handicapping process. Is that kind of what you try to balance as well on your end?
I count on people playing overs because it gives more value to the under. And you're exactly right. If you lose a play, it's quick and it's painless.
All right. Well, hopefully we've got some winners and there won't be too much pain there. Before I get to a rundown of our week 18, our wildcard weekend portfolio. I guess it would be week 19 if we were still keeping track in that sense. Do want to issue a weekly reminder to the audience that I'm partnering with a team over at Right Angle Sports in an affiliate capacity this season. And I know the NFL season is winding down, but college basketball in full swing. And that's where they've really got an unparalleled track record of success. So no obligation whatsoever. But if you're interested in checking out what Right Angle Sports has to offer, you can support Props and Hops by supporting the team over at Right Angle Sports. I've built a custom link you can check out to do so, tinyurl.com/RASpicks. Now, Ron, coming out of that little read, this is typically the part of the show where I would give a solo read of a rapid fire rundown for picks constituting our portfolio for the week. I'm not exactly sure where you drew the line on some of these looks between a bet and a lean. I would like to just focus on the bets here, and people can listen to everything earlier on to get full context on these bets as well as any leans. I'm wondering if there was a look perhaps at a Josh Allen prop, maybe the Packers Cowboys total to the over, perhaps Tampa Bay +3. In any of those areas, anything that you do consider firmly bettable right now?
Yeah. So in terms of firmly bettable right now, I would still. Are you talking props, or if you're talking games too?
All of the
I would
above.
still
Yeah.
go. I would still recommend KC at 4 or less, and I know it's mostly 4.5. You might find a straight 4 somewhere. So even though obviously it's better at 3, we know that, but I have a firm conviction on that. Had I not seen the 3 and had it been 4, I would have played the 4. So I would endorse that. As far as the props, I have to look and see where I wrote these things down.
Oh, good. I will try to do some real-time research as well. I know when we were talking Josh Allen, the numbers have moved like crazy based on the weather. So it seems like don't just blindly bet everything to the under in Steelers Bills now, because we know that there's going to be some wind.
Yeah,
But
it's
it sounds like
mostly
you might
too
still see
late
some
for
meat on the
there.
bone with Josh Allen.
Yeah, it's mostly going to be too late, in my opinion, on that particular one. I have a higher juice prop that we didn't talk about, but it's for the same reason that I laid out earlier when we talked about how starters are going to play longer. So with the assumption that that Amari Cooper is playing, I assume he's playing. I mean, why wouldn't he play at this particular point?
The game of his life against the Texans a couple of weeks ago.
Wide receiver Bell, he had 4 catches last week, but that was an outlier because he was about the only starter that was there. You'd have to still lay, at this point, you're going to have to lay 160, but I would go under 2.5 catches for Bell.
All right, we're talking DeAnthony Bell here, if I've got that right.
I wish I knew
I'm just
his
asking
first
because
name.
I'm shopping around and I'm seeing touchdown props widely available. I'm not seeing reception totals yet, but it sounds like for those who can shop, this is out there. So you said under 2.5 receptions, and what was the price cutoff that you shared?
I think you should cut it off at around 160, and it's trending where you may not be able to find 160 anymore. So I hesitate. I think I saw 160 about midway this afternoon, but you have to shop around. It depends because a lot of places now charge an awful lot for these props. You're not getting 15-cent spreads anymore.
Got it. And thank you, Hector, in the chat, David Bell. Shows how much I know about the Cleveland
Yeah,
Browns depth
David
chart.
Bell.
Okay, here
Thank
we
you.
go. Receptions, that is more widely available. Yeah, 2.5. Okay, there are still some minus 160s out there, but yeah, I'm seeing this also as high as minus 189 at a book that's known to take a bet in this market. So as with everything, can't preach shopping around enough, but especially in props where it's not as easy for books to copy each other, where you can poke around. I'm still seeing several minus 160s on the table. Any wiggle room? Of course, seeing a lot of books at the range of minus 165 or minus 170. Where would you say you're drawing the line here on David Bell receptions under 2.5?
Well, everything is ROI. So the first thing you have to do is how many times is he going to catch one pass? How many times is he going to catch 2, 3, whatever? So in my estimation, to be honest, I think for him to catch 3 or more passes where you'd lose the bet is realistically 1 out of 4 times, probably even worse than that. So if you're going to win the bet 3 times and lose the bet 1 time, then the true proper line on that for my purposes would be minus 300.
Wow.
So
Okay. So
everybody
even, I mean, in that sense, I know
everybody
you.
decides their own pain point, but I
Sure.
just said, how many, it's like when we talked about draft props, and I don't like those minus 500s or whatever, because you lose it once, you feel sick. on the minus whatever. I'd much rather have pluses or back to the minus 115 or whatever. I seldom recommend more than minus 160, but I think we got a favorable price in this game, primarily because Bell had a good showing week 18 when everybody else didn't play.
And I really like the point in your handicap about a lot of the starters playing more in games like this. Every team is fully motivated. So with guys like Amari Cooper being on the field more, that inherently will play a role in diminishing opportunity for receivers like Bell, guys who are further down the depth chart. So I think I also heard Hitman earlier today mention that when he bets props in the playoffs, he's often looking at guys like this because for the known commodities, books have been pricing receiving yard totals, reception totals for the likes of Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, and all the superstars all year long. They're not going to, even with their openers, they're not going to be that far off. But when we move down the depth chart and it gets more difficult for books to price things properly, that means there's a lot more opportunity a lot of the time for us as bettors.
Snap count, I think it is .com. You could get everybody's snap count week by week by week. So if anybody wants to look up how much David Bell played every I'm making sure that it is. It's Football Guys is the name, but you can get it just by snap counts. So it's a valuable resource. I like to look at it when I look at running backs. I want to know how they're dividing it up if it's a timeshare running back situation. It also tells you how many you can get counts on how many times the receiver has been thrown to, but it's nice to look at it week by week by week so you could see progressions.
Yeah. All right. Well, if I were better at multitasking, I would already be down on this, but I'm just going to make a clear note to myself to do so as soon as we wrap up recording. David Bell, under 2.5 receptions, good in the range of minus 160, but consider there to be a bit of wiggle room here, given that Ron's true price is all the way up at minus 300. The juice isn't going to get that high, but shop around, and minus 160s are still out there. And once again, Hector, thank you for weighing in the chat, because I was hopelessly flailing trying to find lines for somebody named DeAnthony Bell. He's on the Browns or the Texans, but David Bell is our guy here, under 2.5. And I'm going to be much quicker running through my bets this week. Again, a lot of leans earlier on in the show with some context if you want to go back and listen to the game-by-game rundown. But as far as bets go, one side right now that I think is actionable, Tampa Bay +3 hosting Philadelphia. A 2-team teaser, Houston +8 paired with Dallas -1, good up to -120 in VIG. And in the spirit of bankroll management, cap that at 0.8 of a unit. The Houston leg is great. The Dallas leg, not as much, but still like a look at some exposure there. As far as props go, 3 of them. Joe Flacco, longest completion, over 38.5 yards, good to a flat -115. And then 2 shortest touchdown props. This shows bread and butter over the years. First up, Green Bay Dallas, shortest touchdown, under 1.5 yards, currently available at -150, good to -165. And Rams Lions, shortest touchdown, also under 1.5 yards, currently available at -155. Consider that good to -165 as well. Last but not least, one derivative, Rams third quarter +0.5 point, currently available at -135. Consider that one good up to -150. Ron, that's been quite the gauntlet going game by game. A lot of bets, a lot of leans, a lot of insight, not even about specific bets or leans, but hopefully to help sharpen the betting approach for everybody who's catching this conversation. And in that spirit, I know we're well north of an hour here, but I can't let you go without weaving in some process-driven questions that can further help to evolve our processes and hopefully make us all sharper in our journey as sports bettors. And first up, maybe this can be a bit quick because it did come up from time to time as we were talking about each game this weekend. But I know there's a lot of conversation right now about a trend that flares up every year at about this time. Quarterbacks and head coaches making their playoff debuts and how they tend to struggle. This applies to 5 teams this weekend. Houston, Stroud, and Ryans, both rookies in their respective roles. Miami, surprisingly to me, this is Tua's first playoff start. It was Skylar Thompson under center for Miami in that wild card loss to Buffalo last year. For Pittsburgh, Mason Rudolph. For the Packers, Jordan Love. And then for Lions on the coaching side of things, Dan Campbell. Ron, I know that we've got a big narrative here. I'm wondering if you're giving this particularly high or low stock for any quarterbacks or coaches that will be in action this wildcard weekend.
Mostly low. Mostly I'd rather handicap the matchups. We talked about Stroud already. Rudolph's been with the same organization for for 5 years or whatever. He's coming off hitting about 70% or more in his last 3 games. He's not thinking playoffs are not just another game. That's the way his coach feels about it. Jordan Love's going to take chances, throw downfield, no matter whether it's a playoff game or not. Dan Campbell, you could say he's the first, time head coach in the playoffs as well. He beats to his own drum. He's going to do whatever he does. He doesn't even know it's a playoff game, probably. He just thinks it's another chance for him to fake punt from the 20 or do whatever. So kind of low for me.
All right. Yeah. And I would say in my book, I know there might be some edges here at, on the fringe cases, but I consider it to be largely priced in. By the time trends and narratives like this are getting this much noise, then it's hard to find an actionable edge when we're especially looking at something like a full game spread in the NFL playoffs. So it's interesting. In some cases, it can apply more or less than others, but I'm not spinning my wheels too much on that front either. Ron, I also want to see how much attention you're paying to weather at the extremes. That looks like it's going to be a factor in Kansas City and Buffalo. In that Chiefs game, extreme temperatures exacerbated by some wind. In Buffalo, likely some snow and cold temperatures, but really the extreme wind, the standout as far as that forecast goes. What kind of impact do severe weather forecasts have on your betting approach?
We talked about wind being the major factor. I think I saw a tweet that the last time it was, this cold in Kansas City, it was like a 38-31 score. So you don't know. Snow sometimes produces some nice overs. For me, my reason for liking Kansas City didn't matter as much about the cold. It was going to be cold no matter what compared to Miami weather. So the fact that I had already handicapped it and had like 4 or 5 other reasons to like Kansas City, it's nice to also have this as a reason, but it really didn't impact me. And Buffalo, it impacted how I handled the props for sure, how I handled any of the passing props and stuff like that. But as far as the game, it probably, since I was wishy-washy on who I liked in the game because I had some negative indicators for both teams, I think it made it easier for me to leave it alone.
Yeah, sometimes the best nudge you can get is the one that tells you not to make a bet if you don't have firm conviction that it's a positive expected value proposition. And I'll just add to that when we get these extreme weather environments, I try to lean into the notion that chaos breeds opportunity. And I don't mean by that I always know the specific opportunities ahead of time. What I try to do is open up books, expand the menus, and just start looking for props and derivatives that might be baking in standard pricing, going off the chart, so to speak, based on the full game point spread in total, and try to identify value based on some non-standard environments in which these games are being played. So we could think of things like longest field goal yardage, fourth down conversions, 2-point conversions, sack over-unders, things along those lines. To wrap it up, I'll quote the Logic of Sports Betting, which is a great read for any up-and-coming bettor, which was quoting Rounders when they used this line in the book. Spot the sucker. Sometimes you don't know what you're going to bet when you log in, but if you can shop around a little bit and spot that sucker, that's often the best opportunity that you'll find on a given week's betting board.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There was one game last week where I knew I had to pivot, but I didn't have a chance. Oh, the Atlanta-New Orleans game. Mm-hmm. I didn't want Desmond Ridder as my starter, and I wanted Alvin Kamara in as somebody who liked Atlanta plus 4 points. Alvin Kamara is negative value to New Orleans when they hand the ball off to him or pass to him. Instead, when he was announced out of the game and I already had Atlanta and I had a good line plus 4, I said, how do I get out of this? Well, I decided to pivot in an unusual way. I took everything I could on Taysom Hill, rushing yards, rushing, receiving, and so on, because I think he added that extra dimension to that team that made me feel pretty bad about my play. And if Taysom Hill wasn't going to get the job done, then I was okay with Atlanta. But I just had this feeling that I was going to see too much of Taysom Hill, and that worked out.
And Ron, speaking of pivoting, that's a perfect opportunity to transition into one of the pillars of the show. This week's Malinsky Minute might be a bit of an extended edition, but I like to think of pivoting here in the sense that Dave was really a creature of habit, and he was unparalleled with his routines, finely in tune with the rhythm of the sports betting calendar. Where the pivot comes into play here is that, yes, we're still talking NFL, the same rules apply, But in the playoffs, it's not necessarily business as usual. In some ways, we are going to be shifting gears. So I'd love to hear anything that comes to mind, Ron, if I'm to ask you about any top tips, perhaps, when it comes to betting the playoffs that don't apply as much to the regular season.
I think you can get more runaway games in the playoffs because that all or nothing mentality. So one of the things is maybe look a little bit more in game. If something's going south for a team, it may continue to go south. So if one team really looks like they're overmatched, they're not going to let up. They're not going to necessarily let up in the third or fourth quarter because they don't want to be the victim of that 20-point comeback that knocks them out of the playoffs. And they say, "Oh my goodness, we shouldn't have sat on the lead." They're gonna still play to compete all the way through. My personal portfolio, which I've hinted already, contains a lot of unders for prop plays. I understand that all or nothing starters play so much, and even though I recommended the David Bell, there are starters that I will pivot and play more overs on props during the bowl season. I'm talking college, but during the playoff season, because they're not necessarily like you said. These things have been priced the same. All the star players continue to get priced the same, but they're going to play more minutes in the playoffs. So I might pivot a little bit more to overs for the starters as far as my prop playoff portfolio.
I think that aligns really well with one of the tips I wanted to share. I've got a few of them, and I'll try to be pretty efficient with the delivery and get your thoughts, Ron. A disclaimer right off the top, some of these will require a bit of effort. So I understand it's not for everybody if you just want to sit back and make some casual low stakes wagers. But I will say that a little legwork can really go a long way here. And when it comes to props, building on your point, my rule of thumb is typically to look toward betting overs early and unders late. Of course, if we're talking extreme weather, that can flip. Maybe you want to be first to the unders and figure out if you want to play back some overs later. But in standard conditions, typically, while this isn't unique to the playoffs, I think it can be magnified by the added influence of more recreational money in play. I think of something like quarterback rush yards, and we'll hear a lot of talk of these being high leverage games, as you just touched on. And with athletic quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Dak Prescott, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson next week when the Ravens are back in action, yes, these guys might be more inclined to run than they would be during a regular season game. And maybe that's not going to be priced into some openers if books are relying on season long averages. But those edges tend to get gobbled up really quickly. So you often need to be early if you're going to bet the over. Otherwise, sometimes those overs just end up taking on too much steam as the narrative spreads, and there can be value coming back the other way on unders. So, Ron, any thoughts on that notion as far as it hopefully complements your approach to props in the playoffs?
Yeah, I like it. And I'd like to add one more thing that disgusts me in that you really have to be faster on props than ever before. And we don't have enough time in the show to get into why the prop market has changed so much. But you used to be able to get some of these plays Thursday night, Friday night, even in playoff games. Now, if it's Wednesday afternoon, you're too late.
Yeah. And sometimes if the ship has sailed on the best of a number, if the steam goes too far, what might have sounded like a good bet Wednesday at a certain point could be an even better bet going the other direction on Saturday afternoon or Sunday
Very
morning.
true. Very true.
And one thing I'll add is another tip, kind of to that same end of being adaptable in the way we approach things here. Futures and money line rollovers is two different ways to get at the same outcome. Futures bets can be really fun, especially at the outside of the playoffs, trying to identify who's going to win a conference and go on a deep run or maybe win the Super Bowl. And I'll say to that, it is a good time, but for a bigger payout on the same outcome, oftentimes a money line rollover, also known as a mechanical parlay, can be the way to go. An example I'll share here is that the Rams, I've heard a lot of talk about them as a pick for a team that could make a run, and a lot of people would like to see that. They're somewhere in the range right now, depending on your books, probably 16 to 1 to 18 to 1 to win the NFC. And that can sound like a really nice lottery ticket to have. But when we consider the path here, they need to win this weekend at Detroit, then most likely next weekend at San Francisco, depending on the outcome of Packers Cowboys. And if the chalk holds, the Rams would then need to win a third straight road playoff game in Dallas, where they got blown out earlier this season. So the path could entail the Rams having to sweep the NFC's top 3 seeds all on the road. So relatively speaking, while 18-1 sounds like a nice payout, we can probably do better in some cases. And to make this concrete, if you're a $100 better, a $100 futures bet on the Rams right now to win the NFC would return $1,800 in profit. Or you could start this week on the money line with the Rams plus 140 or so at Detroit. That $100 money line bet would return $240 should the Rams win. Your $100 risk plus the $140 in profit. Roll that over in the division round. If they win again, roll it over in the conference championship round. When all said and done, again, this is dependent on the path, but I think more likely than not, the profit would be a good bit north of $1,800. And last but not least here, with this approach, the money line rollover as opposed to the one-shot futures ticket, we've got a couple added edges, and that you can shop for the best money line across different books each round versus being tied to one book's price at the outset of the postseason. And then number 2, there's the element of a ripcord here. If there's a key injury or the Rams win a couple games and then suddenly there's a matchup you don't like and you don't want too much exposure on, with the money line rollover, you can take the money and run after any round in a way that you can't with a futures bet. You can hedge in different ways, but the money line rollover gives some nice flexibility to shop around or just take the money and run if you want to. So, Ron, I am trying to be efficient. I know that might be a bit long-winded. Want to see what you think about this angle as far as money line rollovers versus futures.
Good advice. That's all I'd say. People listening, once again, Matt's done his homework, so that's the way to go. There used to be such thing as open teases and open parlays and all that. I think a lot of books have gotten rid of that, but in some way, one of the points you made is the most valuable, is that it doesn't tie you down to one book. You take the best of each number each time.
All right. Well, I've got one more tip to share. We'll see if I can get your endorsement here as well. This one will be pretty short and sweet. Something that I found to be really helpful is I've layered it into my own betting process over the last 2 years in the playoffs, having projected point spreads ready for potential matchups for the next round before the current round kicks off. I say this because the market can move really fast. You touched on it for props, and that's definitely the case for openers with any errors on spreads or totals as well. And it's important to be ready to pounce on any soft openers if you really want to maximize your bankroll during the playoff betting cycle. And doing this can sound like a daunting undertaking, but I can throw out a couple of shortcuts that can get you most of the way there without doing all of the painstaking work. First up, I like to look at publicly available power ratings. There are a lot of sources out there that are pretty reputable. Over the years, I have made a habit of checking out what Steve Fezzik posts over at pregame.com. You don't have to buy picks or anything like that. The publicly available power ratings, not the be-all, end-all, but something like that can be a good starting point. Also looking at closing lines, if any games are rematches or if we've got some common opponents in play, you can just triangulate things as a pretty quick and easy heuristic in that sense. And I would be remiss not to mention adjusting for factors such as injury or recent performance if we are talking injuries or any power ratings that were posted prior to the most recent game being played. So, Ron, is that part of your process, or do you just generally kind of go by feel when lines come out because things can be moving so fast and furious as one round of the playoffs is ending and lines for the next round are already getting posted?
Yeah, so several thoughts here. First of all, I set my own power ratings, have for 30, no, I shouldn't say
There we
30,
go.
like 43 years. So,
Wow.
so I know what my power ratings are, and as soon as a number comes out, I know if to say, wow, this or that or whatever. I think what's educated the public more, not just the sharp bettor, but the modest recreational bettor, is every week during the year, at least the last couple of
Mm-hmm.
years, you've been privy to look ahead lines. So you
Yep.
kind of know what's going on. And I think that's gotten people better informed as to, yeah, I should look at this beforehand. So I think that's a really good thing. Your tip about Steve Fezzik is a good one. I do not know Steve Fezzik, but I know I align with him a lot. I listen to his show and I think, gee, he's taking the words right out of my mouth. I'm talking on Tuesday, he's talking on Wednesday and stuff like that. But I think I'm pretty aligned with him. I would guess that our power ratings are very, very similar. So if he posts those, that's a great resource as well. But I never look at lines until I've set my own.
And as part of that, to make sure that you're being as objective as possible and not
Yeah.
letting too many external factors cloud your judgment.
Absolutely. I want to form my opinion before I see something. And then artificially I'd say, well, I guess I would have said it here, when in reality I wouldn't have done that, but I'm being influenced by what I'm seeing.
Mm. And one more point before we move on from this topic. I know I plugged Fezzik's power ratings, and that has served me well over the years. But when you say that you make your own and you're also ready to go before lines get posted based on your numbers, are those publicly available anywhere? Is that also a resource that listeners of this show could find on their own?
I do not, I don't have a website. I don't have anybody
All
paying
right.
for my picks. I don't have anything. 3 years ago, nobody had ever even heard of me except for about 15 people in my select circle. So thanks to you and the show and others, I'm here and I share process questions and we
Mhm.
brainstorm. You and I are brainstorming. Chris and I brainstorm, and any other shows that I'm on, we're always brainstorming. I got a NCAA show that I'd like to do to brainstorm. The exit report that you did with me last year when you did the Chargers, that's
Mhm.
brainstorming, but no power ratings online.
All right, fair enough. Had to make sure we weren't omitting something that could be of value, maybe in the future, but if not, just the contributions that you're giving in plenty of other areas, making all this more than worthwhile. Ron, one more topic to hit on as we hit the home stretch. Gotta talk the hops when I've got you on the show. I know it's January 11th, so I'm wondering on one hand if it's too early, or one hand if it's too late to ask about your first beer this year. If I recall correctly from the top of the show, that Guinness in hand may be the ticket when it comes to answering that question.
Yeah, no, that's my first beer this year. The one I shared with the family that my daughter and son-in-law that they brought back, that from the Stone Brewery. That was the last
Mm.
beer of last year, at the end of last year, and this Guinness is the first beer of this year. We have gone to wineries in the Temecula area. There's too many to go to all the time, but I'm not
Mm.
really a wine drinker, so if they don't have beer, I just sip my wife's wine and that's it.
Yeah, and if that bomber of the Stone, I think it was an Imperial Stout, if that was my last drink of 2023, I might also need at least a week and a half before I'd get back into
Yeah.
things in 2024. So it sounds like you've taken the prudent path. I will share with you and the audience that my first beer of the year was one by the name of Just Two Things, Citra and Nelson. This is a hazy double IPA by my favorite brewery, Green Cheek Beer Company, based in Orange, California. And it's a fun concept here. Just Two Things is an IPA series Green Cheek has been working on that highlights two hops, and it's an experiment with different hops with each release of the Just Two Things series to kind of see where the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. And I'd say that definitely applied to this one. With the Citra hops, there were notes of mango, grapefruit, and pineapple. That's right up my alley. Nelson hops often have notes of passion fruit, grape, and white wine. Think like a Nelson Sauvignon Blanc kind of connection there. And typically, I myself am also not a wine drinker. So Nelson is not something I tend to gravitate toward when I see it listed as a hop in a beer. But big fan of Nelson paired with Citra, thanks to this beer. And beyond the beer itself, I want to note that the environment played a key role. I was fortunate to be sharing it with a friend who had just gotten great news that she is now cancer free. And so everybody was in great spirits and she raved about how good that beer was. She typically doesn't go toward beer too often, but this one was very approachable and thoroughly enjoyed by all. So I think it was a nice reminder that the drinking experience can go well beyond the drink itself.
Oh, yeah, I'm still waiting for all the beers that people are going to send me. That fact that Dennis Allen still has a job, and I was able to lobby for him to stay as the Saints coach. I think everybody owes me a dark beer.
All right. Well, if I can get down to the Temecula area anytime soon, or if you find yourself back up here for any reason, I'll be glad to take care of that however I can. Or maybe we can play around with some flat rate boxes making their way between your neck of the woods and mine via the U.S. Postal Service. So we will consider that is probably an NFL play for early off season to do. In the meantime, want to make a quick ask to the audience as we wrap things up here. To those of you still with us on YouTube and Twitter, first off, thank you so much for tuning in and enjoying this marathon session this evening. Would really appreciate it if you could like this video. To those of you catching this in podcast form, if you could take 5 seconds to leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that would be greatly appreciated. And last but not least, however you're listening, you can also support this show by supporting Right Angle Sports. A custom link I've built to do so is tinyurl.com/RASpicks. Hector, I see another comment from you complimenting the discussion. Thank you so much. Ron has been a great guest, and I will see what we can pry out of him as far as that ultra secret 40-year edge is concerned. So hopefully more to come on that front. In the meantime, as we wrap things up, want to remind everybody they can follow Ron on Twitter at Ron A Sports. Ron, thank you so much for the time and insight tonight. It's always a blast, and this conversation has proved once again to be no exception.
Yeah, it's really enjoyable talking to you. It's so easy and it's so fluid, and the time just goes by. Before we know it, we got Wild Card Weekend. So thanks for having me. There'll be some writing that comes out later this week. Actually, it's out already. I just have to post it so that everybody knows what it is. It's kind of a similar to what we discussed today, and I urge everybody to bet responsibly and enjoy the games, because after this week, then we're really down to just a few more games.
Well said. On that note, to tie a bow around this conversation, I would like to thank everybody one more time for watching and listening. Really appreciate your time. Enjoy Wildcard Weekend in the NFL. I'll catch you next week to preview the division round, arguably the best weekend on the NFL calendar with the heavyweights back in action. In the meantime, thanks again, everybody, and best of luck with your bets on Wildcard Weekend.